So today, are you able to hear me? Okay. So today we're going to talk about child torture. And just to put this in perspective, without going, saying a lot about my background, I had worked for child welfare. I was a child protective service caseworker in 2 states, and then a supervisor, area administrator in Spokane, and so forth. And I had worked in these two child welfare systems for more than 30 years before I left the agency in 2004. And during that time, I had probably seen less than, a handful, less than 5 child torture cases total in those 30 years. There hadn't been, to my knowledge, any deaths, and I think I would have known that in the offices where I worked, and I was quite sure they didn't happen in Washington because I had a role in reviewing all child fatalities every year from about 1988 to when I left in 2004. And there were no child torture fatalities that I remember during that time period. So, so what I'm going to talk about now is a challenge, a problem, however you want to face this, of kind of recent origin. I mean, in terms of the frequency of this, which is, so it used to be, and I guess what I'm trying to communicate is incredibly rare. And now it's not incredibly rare. It's not common, as I'm going to explain here. It's still very uncommon. You would have to say that it's infrequent. It's infrequent enough that, someone could work potentially in a child protective service system for maybe even a decade, and just depending on the luck of the draw, might not have any child torture cases. And then on the other hand, might have more than one or something, but it's no longer rare in this state. And the reason I know this is because I've been doing training and writing on this subject for the last several years. And as a result of that, I sometimes get phone calls or, and email messages from people who work in the CPS system in this state, or sometimes in adoptions, as I'm going to explain here, around current child torture cases. And so this has become something that is very definitely something that happens. I mean, when I came back, I started doing training in this state in 2016 after working for Casey Family Programs for several years. And when I began to do training, I do training through a contract with the Training Alliance at the University of Washington School of Social Work. And I sat down with these people in 2016. These are people I've known for a lot of years. And so we have very candid discussions about matters of interest there. And at the time, I asked them about training on child torture because I had become aware of this. And they told me that there wasn't any at that time, and that they had had a discussion about this and decided that it wouldn't be a good thing to train on because, one, it was so uncommon. And secondly, they thought it would freak out or, cause a lot of fear in the minds of new caseworkers who were just becoming accustomed to the field. And it was almost better that they didn't know about this because it might scare them off, blah, blah, blah. Well, I found that a very incredible type of explanation. And so, of course, I began to pressure them to include training, and not just because of my pressure, but also because there were more cases. The Training Alliance and the basic training that they do for child welfare staff in the state began to do training on this by about 2018. So now there is really some training on the subject, which there wasn't before. So just to explain this a little bit, I had left child welfare in the last part of 2004 in the state. And then in 2005, there was a very famous case of a child death in the Colville office. This child actually lived in Deer Park, Washington, which is in eastern Washington. And it is outside, I don't want to say a suburb, but it's a small town outside of Spokane. And it's between the Spokane office and the Colville office. And this child was 7 years old at the time. And I read about all this in the newspaper. To say this again, I mean, this was reported on at length in the Spokesman Review. And so this child was 7. This child died of dehydration, actually. This child had been starved and systematically denied food and water over a period of months or perhaps even years. And it turned out on autopsy that he had been beaten as well, but he actually died of dehydration. And this had gone on for really a long time. And this was an adoption. And his mother was a paralegal in the Spokane area, and was viewed there by many in the medical community and the child welfare system as almost a saint, because she had taken so many difficult kids from around the country and had several adoptive kids. This was one of them. And so she had a reputation for just being an extraordinary type of person. She had relationships with medical personnel in that area, particularly in the hospitals in Spokane. So she actually had pediatric support for what she was doing there, which was she was in a power struggle with this child, who again was 7 years old, over feeding episodes. And this kid frequently wouldn't eat his dinner, wouldn't eat what she fed him. And so she would make him go to bed without dinner. And then she also denied him water as well. And not just once or twice. You know, I've done training on this subject with caseworkers over a period of years. And sometimes people will be very defensive or uncomfortable because maybe they sent their kid home. They sent their kid to bed once or twice without dinner because of acting out at the dinner table. But this isn't what's being discussed here. I mean, this was, you know, over a period of weeks or months. And so what happened here is that the school became very concerned about this child because he begged for food in the school environment. He was obviously thin. And so the adoptive mother was very adamant that the school should not feed this kid extra snacks or feed him any food outside of whatever he might get at lunch. And she even petitioned the principal of the school to make sure that this kid was not able to go to the toilet alone because he might drink in her opinion, from the toilet bowl. And she didn't want him to be able to do that because she wanted him to teach him, you know, that he had to take food and water at the prescribed kind of times. Well, of course, this made the school incredibly uncomfortable. But of course, at the time, this adoptive mother had close relationships with people in Spokane who were in the medical community, very prestigious doctors. And so the people in Colville then would call the doctors up, and they would confirm that, yes, they had agreed on this as a sort of a plan of how to deal with the behavior of this particular child. So initially, there weren't CPS investigations, even though there were CPS reports. Later on, there were CPS investigations that were conducted by the licensing group in the Spokane office. Nevertheless, this kid ended up actually dying from this, died of dehydration, and in the winter had actually broken out his screen, the window in his bedroom, broken out the screen to get out to eat snow, because remember, he died of dehydration. Well, that was the first death that I was aware of in this state. And remember, I worked in this system for 26 years. This was the first death that I was aware of that was due to starvation, deliberate, and to the denial of food and water. And so just FYI, in that particular instance, the adoptive mother was eventually sentenced to, it was either 7 years in prison or 11 years, something like that, not for murder, but for manslaughter, and then got out after 7 years. So the adoptive mother here, who was the perpetrator of these acts, has really been out of prison for a long time. Well, it turned out that the same kind of events, sort of in general, had happened to other kids in the home, but just not to the same degree. No other kids died, but other kids had also been denied food and water in a very restrictive way, and had been to some extent beaten as well. So that's the first case that I knew of in Washington that was like this. And then in 2012, as amazing as it sounds, there had been in the prior 2 years something like a dozen either deaths or near deaths. And these were kids, for the most part, who were in adoptive families, who had also been, you know, as starved in a deliberate kind of way, and usually physically abused as well. And they had been typically dehumanized and humiliated in various ways. So there started to be kind of a profile of torture. And so there was such a concern in this state at that time that the Office of Children Ombudsman, Ombuds office now, as it's called, then the Ombudsman's office, in 2012 actually convened a committee of prestigious professionals in the state, and they looked at these recent deaths, and there had been a bunch of them because there had been a kind of a forced march of adoptions in this state in the prior 2 years. A new leader had come from out of state, and she wanted to get kids out of the child welfare system, and she pushed hard to get a lot of kids adopted. So the end result was, it seems that a lot of kids went to adoptive families that really couldn't manage them or handle them in terms of the behavior. And so there ended up being these very surprising group of fatalities. And so in 2012, the Ombuds office, then the Ombudsman's office, released a report, which is available online, which is about these cluster of deaths and near deaths that had happened in Washington recently. And I'm not even sure that they used the word torture. I can't remember whether they even used the word in the report. And so this has been another one of these characteristic things. So there had been, since then, there had been a number of cases in this state, some of which has resulted in death, many of which have not. I mean, I'll come back and talk about that here in a minute, but also in other places in the country as well. So some of you may have watched or been aware of the documentary, The Trial of Gabriel Fernandez, which came out a few years ago during the pandemic year. And Gabriel Fernandez died in 2013, 2014 in Los Angeles, or at least a suburb of Los Angeles. And this was an 8-year-old child who had been, again, starved and also forced to sleep in a sort of a little dark cupboard or closet at night, which is another common feature in these cases, by the way, and had also been humiliated. He had been forced to eat his own vomit. I'm not making this up. This is from news stories. He had been sent to school in girls' clothes. He had been mercilessly beaten by the boyfriend of the mother. And so that became a really famous case. And since then, Los Angeles, as amazing as it sounds, in the very same jurisdiction where Gabriel lived, has had a couple of other high-profile child torture deaths. And I have read newspaper stories on those articles now for several years, on those deaths for several years. And not one of those newspaper stories ever even mentions the word torture. It's like, it's not okay to use the word in certain child welfare circles. It's not, I guess, politically correct thinking. I'm not sure completely why, but there has been an avoidance of even looking at these deaths from that perspective. And so I kind of want to emphasize how unusual these deaths are. Like, I have studied child abuse and neglect related fatalities for years. I mean, since the mid to late 1980s. I mean, I've published articles on this subject, and I used to do yearly reviews of all child maltreatment fatalities in the state. And so child maltreatment fatalities usually have some the dynamics of it are just totally different. I mean, they usually 45% of kids are infants. I mean, the 80% of kids are 0 to 3. They're mostly, if they die from abuse kind of thing, that's battered child syndrome. I mean, it's impulsive acting out behavior in response to crying. The dynamics of the cases are just completely different. A lot of the kids who have died from the deaths that I am describing as torture deaths in this state and other states have been school-age kids, as amazing as it sounds. School-age kids. I mean, so anywhere from 6 to 17 years of age. So I just want to emphasize how unusual that is in child welfare. That's just something that just almost does not happen. And yet, at least in past years, it didn't, but now it increasingly does happen. And in addition, of course, I've mentioned the focus in this state has been on adoption, but these cases have also occurred to some extent in foster care. They've occurred to a somewhat lesser extent in birth families, but there have been some of those cases in birth families, especially in other states. I cooperated on a study of child maltreatment fatalities in Minnesota over the last 8 years, within the last 12 months. And they had 14 fatalities in 8 years, and that were just, I would describe as torture. And those were mostly in birth families with mentally ill parents. But, I haven't seen those kind of cases here. I mean, some of them probably exist, but I haven't actually seen them. So this has become an actual kind of phenomena. And just to say this again about how different the dynamics of the thing are. I mean, so a lot of the punishment that, because the kids are school age, a lot of times when they are severely injured or die, they don't die in a single incident. They die after a long period, months or perhaps even years of torture, what I would describe as torture. It's very lot of times the behavior of the parents is very deliberate and thought out. They frequently are people who are middle class or even upper middle class. I mean, not only this person I mentioned in Deer Park was a paraprofessional, but I consulted on cases in this state within the last year where people in town who are doing these things to kids own businesses. So sometimes very prestigious people, very articulate, educated, sometimes with college degrees, who could always defend their behavior in some articulate way. And of course, they could always afford attorneys. And so some of the families have fought these cases in a sort of a very persistent way before giving up the kids, which has frequently happened in cases where kids did not die here. So one more thing I'm going to say, and then I'll open this up for questions, is that in terms of the dynamics of these cases, they tend to begin as power struggles. That is, and power struggles in families are very common. I mean, I would be surprised if anyone in this Zoom meeting lives in a family that hasn't had several power struggles between individuals in the family and involving the kids frequently. So that's not anything unusual. But the power struggles over time have become malignant. And the way that you tell the difference between, so to speak, a normal power struggle within a family and a power struggle that can result in a child death is that a parent or a caregiver at some point decides that they are going to crush a child's will, whatever it takes. So this is the key sort of transition point between power struggles that can be stopped through, quote, so to speak, treatment or through therapy or counseling or something like that, which is often the case in the early stages. You can stop this kind of stuff in the early stages. Once it becomes torture, there's no treatment for that. Once that's identified and recognized, kids have to be removed from the home, whatever their age, and whatever the class status of the families is. It is not okay to leave kids there where a system of torture has already kind of developed here. So power struggles become malignant. Caregivers decide that they have to crush a child's will at all costs. And then at some point, and it's hard to say where it is in these cases, it's not initially, but at some point, it's obvious that caregivers begin to take pleasure in cruelty toward children. I mean, it's not just that they're being cruel, is that they are taking pleasure in that cruelty. I mean, there's a really thought out, deliberate quality to it all. And the kids a lot of times are scapegoated kids. And some of the really shocking cases in this state, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, there have been situations where other kids in the family have also been allowed to take part in the abuse of the scapegoated child. So sometimes it's not just the parents or a parent or parent caregiver. Sometimes it's the other kids in the family as well, because the kids have they are serving as a scapegoat for the entire family. And again, the things that tell you right off the bat that you're looking at something unusual is this denial of food and water that shows up in so many of the cases. And of course, also forcing the kids to sleep or stay for long hours in very enclosed, dark spaces, in closets, in cupboards. There's one famous case in Snohomish County in 2008 or 9, something like that, where a child was older, a teenager, was forced to sleep in the backyard in the winter, chained with handcuffs in the backyard. And that has also been something that's happened in many of the cases. And there's always humiliation and dehumanization of the kids. That's a constant feature here. So before I go any further with this, maybe I'm just going to stop here and see if you have comments or questions.
This reminds me a lot of Dave Pelzer's story, from quite a few years ago, Child Called It. And I just had no idea it was so prevalent. It's just sickening.
Yeah, hard to say how prevalent it is exactly, but it's not, as I'm saying, it's not rare anymore. But I mean, I would say today probably that there are one or more cases in probably all DCUIF regions today. Probably, I mean, I know of a few, but to guess, but but still it's possible for very experienced people to work for a long time without necessarily ever being assigned one of these cases. And so one of the characteristics of these cases very frequently is that caseworkers don't really recognize what's going on. I mean, even experienced caseworkers don't, because they haven't encountered it before. And so you don't recognize something if you haven't encountered it sort of over and over again. I mean, so a lot of the dynamics in child welfare we're familiar with because, of course, the families, we just encounter them over and over again. And the families have chemical dependency issues. They have mental health issues. Domestic violence is common in the families. The families are poor. We're familiar with those dynamics because they just happen in thousands and thousands of cases a year. But these kind of cases, a lot of times that don't involve poverty, that may not involve any drug use at all. And it's not true. For the most part, you may think, well, these parents must have been mentally ill. Just not true. In any kind of conventional kind of way, at least, that's just not true of a lot of the cases that have occurred in this state. In some of the cases I saw in Minnesota, it was true. There were some birth parents who were very definitely mentally ill, and in a few instances had tortured whole entire sibling groups of all ages. I mean, there were some really horrendous cases there in that sample that I reviewed, right? But I haven't seen those kind of cases here. I'm not saying they don't exist. I just haven't seen them. And so, so not incredibly rare. Now, there has just been within the last 3 months a study that I sent to Ryan, which he has, which is about a study, and there have not been many studies of torture in the peer-reviewed journals, only a few. And this is one of the few in recent years, and it's a Washington State study. So a lot of the information about torture, as amazing as it sounds, has come from Washington because of these famous cases, but also because some of the people who worked on these studies, the few that exist, are actually at the University of Washington or were at the University of Washington. And so some of the sample is Washington cases. And so this study that I sent to Ryan is a study of 47 torture deaths that occurred over a period of about 10 years in the state. And in those cases, only one of those kids died. The cases that I'm familiar with here in Washington State, the really famous cases, almost all of the kids died. Not all of them did, but most of them did. But in the study that I sent to Ryan, the 47 cases, there was only one death. But in other respects, the cases very much resembled or had the dynamics that I've just mentioned here. For the most part, the kids were of school age. Many of them had serious behavior problems. The parenting behaviors that I'm describing as torture evolved out of power struggles. For the most part, the parents were not mentally ill. They all had articulate defenses of what they were doing. And the point that Ken Feldman was one of the authors of this article, a pediatrician who was on the Child Abuse Consultative Network for many, many years here. The point this article makes is that the parents were in no way remorseful. That is, once these cases came to light, there were some criminal actions in these cases. In many cases, of course, they ended up losing the kids, but the parents didn't feel guilty about it because they felt they had a rationale, a good rationale for what they were doing, which was they had an oppositional kid and sometimes subject to meltdowns who simply wasn't going to go along with whatever was expected within the family. And they, in effect, were not given much help, in their opinion, by the Child Welfare Agency. And so they had to take things into their own hands. And sometimes they went to therapists who actually were complicit with all this. And that's the other feature of some of these cases, that many times these middle-class, upper-middle-class families have professional allies. They have people who are therapists or doctors who have supported these kind of behaviors. And once they are accused of these behaviors, they are well defended by attorneys. So it's not like they roll over and say, oh, yeah, I was wrong and blah, blah, blah. No. And in some of the instances, they have fought tooth and nail to hang on to those kids. In other cases, they have, of course, resisted any finding that any substantiation of the behavior in terms of a finding of abuse or something, right? So again, let me stop here and see if you have other comments or questions about it.
Dee, one thing that comes up is, as you mentioned, scapegoating. So I'm aware of some cases where child that was scapegoated was definitely tortured, and Children's Hospital verified it and everything. But then the argument in the department perspective is the other children in the home are safe. We'll just remove the scapegoated child and everything will be okay. Parent will do triple P or something and we'll be done. And I can think of at least 2 cases like that. And I went looking for research on this subject. Is there, do we have any evidence that a parent who scapegoats one child is likely to scapegoat another? It seems to me to be something psychological within the parent that would incline them to that sort of behavior. But I don't know if you know anything about that.
No, and to say this again, there have only been a couple of studies that I'm aware of, that have large samples and so forth. And so there was one that came out about 2014, 2013. I have that study. I don't remember that it even mentions the issues related to siblings. The famous case that I mentioned in Deer Park in 2005, she had in fact done the same kind of stuff to other kids in the family. But there have been other instances. So there was a famous case that I mentioned in Snohomish County where a couple who had engaged in had taken a number of kids, in the double digits in international adoptions over a period of several years. They had scapegoated a child, a refugee child who was, I think, from Somalia, and she and her brother lived within the family. And that was genuinely a scapegoated kid in the sense that the same thing that was happening to that child was not apparently happening to other kids in the family. In that particular instance, it didn't matter so much because both of those people went to prison. They got prison sentences of somewhere between 27 to 32 years. So the kids in that instance, of course, they all went to other people, right? So I think it's really very much of an open question. Just I know that these kind of cases engender really strong feelings of how could any child live there. But I think there are probably some families where it probably is only happening to one kid because there is a scapegoated kid. Now, whether or not that would subsequently happen to another child once the scapegoat was removed, again, that seems like definitely a risk to me. But in terms of empirical studies that would confirm that, I just haven't seen them. Because again, the child welfare scholars have not been much interested in this subject. This has only been some pediatricians, Ken Feldman being one of them, from around the country that even brought this to light in the peer-reviewed journals, right? Now, as far as the cases that I know of in this state that have involved either adoptee families or foster families, for the most part, the ones that I'm aware of, and that's only a handful, the scapegoated child, the child who's been subjected to torture, has been removed from the family, but not necessarily the other kids, and definitely not the birth kids of the parents, right? And so that just is what's happened in this particular state. So I guess what I'm saying is we don't know for sure from research what to think about this in terms of risk to other siblings. And it's possible that it varies from family to family, depending on how this all developed in the first place. And of course, the psychological background of the parents, right? So you would think that there would be something very distinctive about people who would ultimately engage in this kind of behavior. But frankly, from the cases that I've seen, I just hadn't seen it. Some of these people appeared to be pretty well functioning people. Even the person in Deer Park that I mentioned earlier who murdered that kid, in a grotesque way, she had apparently gone for years providing pretty good care and had a lot of support in the Spokane community, including in the Child Welfare Agency. And it was even viewed as a saint there because she would take kids that other people would not take. So I think we're just going to have to acknowledge here to some extent that we have limited knowledge And some of these matters just remain uncertain. There are some cases that are so horrible that it's almost inconceivable that public authorities would leave kids in the custody of these folks, right? And then there are some other cases where things haven't gotten to that point, where a child definitely has not died, and where there is no indication of the abuse of other kids in the family and so forth. In fact, a lot of indication that kids have been pretty well cared for. And I know of a couple of cases like that. Now, to the credit here of DCYF in recent years, because initially when I started talking about this subject in 2016, there was a kind of had been a deliberate decision not just don't discuss it, just don't recognize it, don't bring it up, blah, blah, blah. But that's not true anymore. And there's actually now even some mentioned in sort of guidelines around adoption assessments and so forth that folks in DCYF should be aware of these dynamics and that they should be on the lookout for them. I do want to say, however, and I want to put this in kind of an indirect way, that I know of at least one case now in this state that's going on that has some of these kind of features where that doesn't seem to be recognized by the costs involved. I mean, I know of one case like that, but only one. So this is something that I think we need to be able to talk about. I don't think we need to exaggerate the frequency of it because, again, a lot of kids are horribly abused without this happening. I mean, because of the parents have all kind of mental health or chemical dependency issues and they impulsively act out and all the dynamics that we're aware of, but not this dynamic. And so this is still, you know, kind of an unusual phenomena, but it's one that's widely spread enough that I think a lot of people in DCYF now are pretty aware of it because at some point in time, they probably have encountered it in recent years, or at least someone in their unit has. So let me stop here and see if you have other comments or questions there.
Shelley, why don't you go ahead?
Didn't the Deer Park person only end up doing like 5 years?
I think it might have been 7. It was something like 6. It was something like that. It was about half of whatever the sentence was. And it might have been that the sentence was 9 years or 11 years or something like that. And she ended up serving about half of it.
I can't imagine that the sentence was so light.
Well, I don't know all the ins and outs of it because in that particular case, there was a tremendous amount of news coverage. And the people in the Colville community and people in Deer Park were just outraged. I mean, they were outraged not just over at this person, but they were outraged at the office that didn't stop this. And again, the office, remember, had never seen this before, probably, and not even a single time. And yet the community, of course, they're just mind boggled that something could happen like this to kids, not one time, but over a period of months or years. You know, this kid in the Spokane area, my memory of this is this kid was 7 years old. I think this kid weighed less than 30 pounds at the time of death. I mean, less than 30 pounds for a 7-year-old. So it wasn't like that you couldn't see that something was wrong. And particularly when the kid was begging for food. Now, there have been a couple of other well-known cases in this state. I don't want to say famous because I don't know that anything in child welfare anymore in this state is famous. But there was a case in Everett about 2015, 2014, something like that, where a child who was being raised again in either a foster home or adoptive home was taken to accompanied the parent to a food store, and they were shopping. And it turned out that a law enforcement officer who was off duty came into the store and saw this kid and instantly saw that something was wrong. This kid looked scrawny. This kid looked like was sick or something. And then this guy forced off-duty police officer forced the parent to take this kid to the emergency room. Well, anyway, it turned out that this kid was being starved and that this kid was probably within a few days or weeks of death, actually. And this law enforcement officer, no training, never heard the word child torture probably in his life, and yet he was able to recognize this. Well, the shocking thing about this was that it turned out that this case had been actually reported to CPS on several occasions. And there had actually been caseworkers that go out, more than one caseworker had gone out to visit this child, to investigate these allegations more than one time without somehow being able to recognize that something was wrong and without ever causing this child to be examined by a doctor. So sometimes what you want CPS people to do in these instances, it isn't, as the ad says, atomic physics. It's not, even if they didn't know anything, like the people in Los Angeles, if they had sent Gabriel Fernandez to a doctor, that kid would be alive today, probably, in my opinion, but they didn't. And so part of the reason why they didn't is because Gabriel did not, so to speak, consistently disclose, to use the CPS lingo, or confirm that he was being harmed at home. Sometimes he would say he was, sometimes he would deny it. So that's one of the things that happens with the school-aged kids. I mean, they're calculating their chances of survival here. I mean, what if they say something to a CPS worker and the CPS worker leaves them there? And then it comes to the attention of the parents. Well, that caused death. You know, so the school-aged kids a lot of times are not helping the CPS staff out, and CPS staff are minimizing or paying little or no attention to harm to kids if it doesn't have an obvious physical component. So just editorialize a little bit about House Bill 1227. You know, so this is something House Bill 1227 has done in this state, is it said that kids can only be removed in response to physical injury, physical harm. Well, sometimes in these torture cases, that's not obvious at all, because sometimes the parents have deliberately engaged in behavior that doesn't leave physical marks. You know, the kind of torture cases that I had when I was a caseworker, I only had a handful, but those were all cases where people had really thought about how to hurt kids in a really bad, serious way without leaving physical indications of that. For example, putting a child in a cold bathtub with a whole bunch of ice for 45 minutes and making the kids sit or stand in that bathtub. Or I had one case in the Spokane area where a parent, this was a single mom, was using a cattle prod on her oppositional 15-year-old kid. I mean, she was shocking the shit out of the kid, but he didn't show signs of injury. And of course, I don't even remember that the kid admitted to me that was happening. I think the mother admitted to, she just didn't even see anything wrong with it. I mean, the kid was calling her some F words, and she felt that deserved some kind of response. And so she used a cattle prod. So sometimes the physical harm to kids, a lot of times, at least in the initial stages, once you get into this after a period of weeks or months, there are, of course, going to be physical signs. And that's why you want routinely for caseworkers and for other professionals to make sure that these kids are seen, at the very least, these kids are seen by doctors. Now, you would think that people in the Snohomish County case that I mentioned before, you would think a caseworker who didn't know anything might at least think of the idea of taking a scale out to the home. That is, if the issue was a child being starved and the child supposedly losing weight, being malnourished, I mean, you can look at a growth chart, you can take a scale out, they could have weighed the child. They didn't even do that. They didn't take a scale out. They didn't cause the kid to go to a doctor, and the kid almost died and was saved by a police officer who had not one day of training probably on child abuse and neglect. So sometimes I think almost child welfare training is doing more harm than good, in the sense that it's sort of teaching people to ignore certain kinds of parental actions. But in the torture cases, really, the thing that you have to really be on the lookout for, the indicators, is the deliberate, it's not just the mistreatment, it's the deliberate quality of it. It's the very thought out sadistic quality of it. And of course, all the issues related to the humiliation, the dehumanization of kids, right? And that shows up in all kind of ways. So a couple of years ago, I consulted on a case, and I think it was actually in the Lewis County area, if I remember correctly. It was in Region 6, that's for damn sure. So this foster kid, this was still a foster kid in the home, they were forcing this kid to go to the toilet outside. I mean, that includes both peeing and pooping. But the other kids in the home, of course, that wasn't true of. The kid didn't eat at the dinner table with the rest of the people. He ate different kinds of food than all the rest of the kids did in the family. So some of the behaviors are just so blatant when you look at them in retrospect. But if you only hear of a couple of these behaviors at the time, I mean, people who are articulate can just explain them away and have done so. So.
Shelley, did you want to have a comment?
What exactly would we do in a case like this?
Well, if you become aware of the behavior, I mean, if a constable becomes aware of behavior, you really have to go back to the caseworker. You have to go back to the caseworker and make that information available. But at the same time, my understanding of what Acosta does, I mean, I think you write court reports. I mean, I think you have the ability to describe stuff. You don't even have to make a lot of times judgments about it. You can just describe whatever the concerns are there in a court report. But certainly before that, there ought to be some discussion with the caseworkers and definitely with the attorneys as well about it. Now, of course, what one would hope the caseworker would do, even if they haven't had much experience with it, or they don't recognize this exactly, you would hope that they would use the CPS, the Child Protection Consultation, the Medical Consultation Network, because there really are some physicians in this state and some psychologists who are familiar with this because there have been a number of cases in this state over the years. So there are some people there who are available to the agency that really do have knowledge, but of course someone has to get in touch with them about it. And so some of these people are at Children's Hospital, some of these people are at Harborview. Those are the places. I don't know about, for example, the hospital in Tacoma, the Mary Bridge. I'm not sure of that, but yeah, so you have to make it available. And then I think the other thing in the initial stages, because of course, no one wants to misinterpret things within a family, you know, a lot of unpretty, even kind of ugly things happen in families between parents and kids from time to time without it being torture, you know, so, you know, sometimes you want to hear what people have to say about it, and, you know, an explanation of the behavior and so forth, right? And just to say this again, if you get something in the initial stages, like a power struggle between a kid, I think a lot of times what happens in the adoptive families is the families don't know how to respond to meltdown. So a lot of the kids have trauma histories. I think I've discussed this in some of these past Friday trainings, is that the characteristic, the way you know that kids have trauma histories is that they are particularly vulnerable to meltdowns. And when they have the meltdowns, those are very, very extreme events. And so parents are desperate to figure out ways to handle this. And sometimes they don't get a lot of help necessarily from caseworkers or sometimes from doctors, and they just are sometimes clueless. And so in past years, I mean, maybe a decade ago, there would be adoptive parents who sometimes would have gone to a psychologist who maybe would have given kid a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, which used to be 15, 20 years ago, pretty common. You know, in the last 10 years, that's become kind of a discredited kind of diagnosis within the mental health and the medical care community. But at one time, it was a very, very common kind of thing. And so sometimes then people would develop their own unusual, to say the least, bizarre ways of handling these kind of things. And I can remember 15 or 20 years ago actually listening to a really famous psychologist in the state where I worked for 7 years before I came here, and this guy published books. I mean, he actually ran a residential care facility, which was a famous facility in that state. And I actually heard him recommend in trainings. I actually sat in trainings where he recommended withdrawal of food as a way of dealing with oppositional behavior and so forth, right? He didn't recommend that you starve kids or anything like that, but he recognized, he did advise that parents, you know, engage in the early stages of this behavior, which is a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, it's not because someone does this a couple of times or a few times, that doesn't mean it's torture or something. It's just very unwise. But once this has happened over a period of a month or two, then it deserves another label. And particularly when kids have started to lose a lot of weight as a result of it, or and particularly when it's accompanied by other types of psychological humiliation and dehumanization of the child, which usually you can tell because the kid who's the scapegoated kid, of course, is being treated quite differently than other kids in the family, very, very differently in all kinds of respects.
What does that time window look like in terms of like when it's, because I think we get that a lot where in fact, I was just on the phone with somebody the other day where it's like the relative caregiver or the foster caregiver is actually, they're starting to go down that road, right? Like where they're othering that child. How long do we have, and are there any interventions that we could put in place for the caregiver to say, hey, stop doing this, or when is it too far gone?
Yeah, well, one of those interventions is to say the sentence you just said right off the bat, because, I think a lot of interventions are pretty straightforward. They don't necessarily, that idea doesn't always need to come from a therapist or a doctor. Just this is a really unwise thing to be doing here. And I think in the early stages, and you can tell if people can listen, can hear you, if they can listen to you, if they're at least willing to consider that point of view, if they're willing to try other things, then because power struggles are very, so to speak, treatable. I mean, you don't necessarily have to go to a therapist to stop some crazy power struggle within a family. That's something that we all have to do as self-reflective people on a regular basis. And that's true in marriage, and it's true in other kind of romantic relationships. It's true with kids. I mean, it's true sometimes with friends, with relatives. We all deal with this all the time, right? We're very smart social beings. And so we have the ability to self-correct our behavior. We make mistakes all the time. It's not a wise thing to be, very quickly labeling someone with some kind of bad word because they made some mistakes or errors or something. But if someone is very stubborn in the behavior, and if they sort of speak, you give them some advice, and the end result of that is that they double down on the behavior, they increase it. And if they're very obviously very invested in it, and anytime you hear the perspective that, this kid is going to stop this or else. I mean, once they're invested in crushing the kid's will, and they're actually, probably some of you know that there are actually churches where that's recommended. That's almost viewed as being a part of the theology or something, that, kids are supposed to be obedient, and anything you do to enforce obedience, that's somehow okay, right? So once people are invested in that kind of thing, then you have got to take steps. I mean, and so you hope someone is going to intervene there. And remember the way this is with a lot of the families here, particularly the middle class and upper middle class ones. There's no way official agencies are mistreating these folks without there being a legal defense. These are families that can afford a legal defense, and no one is going to go out there and just remove the kids. That's just is not what's going to happen here. So there is going to be a period of intervention here in some kind of way, and that intervention needs to include medical examination of the kid, as well as issues related to psychological maltreatment. So somehow this is a state that has chosen consciously and weirdly to totally ignore psychological maltreatment within maltreating families. How can anyone believe that that was a sensible thing to do? And yet it's actually encoded in our law. And for years and years, this state has had a neglect statute that doesn't even define what psychological abuse and neglect is in statute. We're the only state in the country that I'm aware of where that's true. That's just plain old strange. That's just plain old weird. But people who work with maltreated kids, you have to have some understanding of this. And so it's not hard to understand, I think, for the most part. Most of us understand and are very sensitive to humiliation. I'd be surprised if there's anyone in this meeting here who hasn't at times, had experiences of being humiliated. And if you have, you remember it, whether it was the hands of bullies within the school system, or whether the hands of teachers or peers or professionals or intimate partners, whoever it was. People remember humiliation. People know when they're being dehumanized, right? So we're very, very sensitive to that as social beings, right? And so again, when we see that kind of thing happening to kids within the foster care system, we have to address it. We have to speak up. It doesn't mean that we have to do the most punitive, censorious thing as our initial act, I mean, we can try to have sensible kind of discussions with people. And sometimes I think a lot of times it's a matter in some families with just who's actually saying it to them. You know, sometimes you can hear messages from one person that you couldn't hear from another, or you just wouldn't tolerate it from this other group of people. But sometimes you can hear it from a person you trust, or from a minister, or from someone who you really think likes your family or loves your family. You can hear a message like that, critical message. So sometimes it's a matter of finding out who is the best person to actually deliver the message, right? And actually, the worst thing that can happen here is that you can send people to professionals, and if they endorse the parental behavior, and that's what's happened in some of these famous cases, they've had professionals endorse the behavior. And that's what happened in the Deer Park case, and it's happened in a number of other cases here. It's almost impossible to stop it then. It's almost impossible to stop it because, hey, the experts agree. You know, the people, and sometimes you don't even have investigations done in this state because an intake person gets a report and they call the professional, and the professional says, well, yeah, this is what we've agreed on as a kind of a course of, quote, treatment for this kid's kind of behavior. And right. And so once that's happened, and you know, things are liable to spiral out of hand really, really quickly. I think I want to say one other thing. I say this again about the school-age kids and about the very difficult position that they're in here, right? So the kids, of course, have had trauma histories for the most part. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in adoptive homes in the first place. They wouldn't be in foster care, at least on a long-term basis, unless bad things have happened to them within the family, you know, within birth families, usually. Okay, so the idea then that someone who the kid doesn't know very well is going to come out to a school or in a therapist office or something, and they're just going to disclose all this stuff, not knowing what's going to happen with that information, and that's going to be an easy and quick thing for kids to do, you know, that's naive. And so a lot of what's happened in some cases is that kids have gotten killed just because caseworkers just were able to say, well, the kid didn't say that to me. The kid didn't disclose it to me, despite the fact that they had eyewitnesses, family members who were saying that they were aware of X, Y, and Z, right? And that's just all going to be dismissed because an 8 or 9 or a 10-year-old kid will not say the magic words to the caseworker, the law enforcement officer, or whatever that is. And that kind of issue has always been there in sex abuse cases. And of course, it's there in these torture cases as well. So you got to be, in other words, you can't take what kids say 100% as being sort of the gospel truth here, right? Because sometimes kids may calculate in very accurately that if they say the wrong thing in this interview, they could actually be killed. They're not going to be removed. They know enough, and they're not going to be removed after that interview. They can actually die or be very severely harmed. And so, you know, so you have to take what kids say to you sort of in that light. It may be that what they're saying is true, and it may be that it's partially true, and it may be just not true at all. And not because they are lying, you know, for some, just because they're liars or something, because they can compute their own interest. I think issues around siblings that someone brought up before, I think those are very, very difficult issues around, well, what if one kid is being treated really well within a family? I've had a few cases like this, and the other kid is the scapegoated kid. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to break up the siblings? I mean, or if you remove one sibling, you remove the other one. I mean, I don't know of any sort of guideline there that I would be willing to say, well, this is the guideline that should be used across the board there. I think that's just something that has to be decided on a case-by-case kind of basis there, right?
In that case that I just had, it was the older sibling saying, I think you should put the younger sibling out of here because they're being scapegoated. I mean, this is a 10-year-old talking about their 8-year-old.
Well, I think I'd have to listen to that, you know, so. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so this is one of these things where whenever you have to learn through very hard experience with cases that are kind of infrequent and you don't have a lot of studies to go back and depend on, there's a learning process here. And I think we all have to kind of acknowledge that that's true. I don't want to pretend to have more understanding of this than I actually have, even though I've studied it for a long period of time, but there's a lot about it surely that I don't understand. And so we shouldn't be pretending to expertise that we don't have or to certainties that we have no basis for having. On the other hand, we cannot ignore it either. I mean, we have to do the best we can here with the information that we've got here. And so we know this kind of thing is happening. And shockingly, it's happening a lot of times with substitute caregivers. That's what's so incredibly shocking here. It's even more in this state with some of the adoptive homes than it is with the birth parents. We just cannot assume that because a kid is this is one of the really hard messages here. We can't just assume that because a kid is in an adoptive home and has been there for a few years that it's all okay. I mean, that's certainly true most of the time in my experience, but there are some instances that I found and that I've mentioned here where it's just not the case here. So. Other kind of comments or questions there? Okay, so just a couple of other things before I end here. I've sent Ryan the one study, the 47 cases, I mentioned that. I have another study also where Ken Fellman is the co-author from about 8 years ago. One of the first studies published on the subject, and these are really horrific pictures and everything. I mean, I'll send this study to Ryan as well. And then several years ago, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, I wrote a sounding board on child torture, which if I haven't sent it already, then I will send it. And that's just like a 23 to 2,500 word kind of summary of this kind of information there. I'll send that out as well there, right? And so I guess the other thing that I would like to ask for is, for those of you who are on this Zoom training, is that if you know of cases in this state, and my guess is some of you do, I mean, I'd like to know about them. I don't think, you don't have to give me the names of people or anything involved, this was a foster family and the kid was X amount of years old and so forth. And so just send me some information about whatever it is you know about the case. And if you followed it for some time, well, what happened as a result? And was there actually a recognition by the child welfare people? And most importantly, I suppose, by the court? Was there a recognition that this had actually occurred? If so, what did the court do in response to that? And yeah, anyway. Okay, I think I'll stop there and thank all of you for taking part in this. And so I don't know, next, Ryan, end of the month here, of course, is the holiday. So maybe we can talk about a date in January or something when.
Yeah, in January, let's go ahead and do that and skip the end of the year one. That sounds great, Dee.
Dee,
Okay,
thank you.
yeah.
This is information we need to hear, even though it's really horrible information. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate your time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And so if any of you guys want any of the materials, as soon as Dee gets them to me, I'll put you on the list and I will get those materials out to you. Other than that, have a great holiday. And like we said, no fourth Friday well, I guess it is December, but at the end of this one, and then we'll resume again in January. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Ryan.
you.